Hello, we're making meaning, telling our stories with the conviction that you're a story too.
My name's Andy Griffiths.
And my name's Imogen Ney.
And this is the fourth in a series of conversations about making meaning. We're hoping that we can tell the story of lockdown and emergence, whatever we want to call them, in ways that help other people tell their stories too. And we're excited to be joined by Dr. Megan Warner. Meg is tutor in Old Testament at Northern College, Manchester, and teaches at Luther King House, as well as being associated with King's College London at the University of Exeter.
Meg, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Can you tell us a bit about how you're telling the story of lockdown?
I think I'm telling the story of lockdown in a couple of ways. One slightly dramatic, one far less so. A couple of months into lockdown, I heard from my stepmother, who said that my father, who is in Perth, Western Australia, was quite ill. And so I suddenly, in the middle of lockdown, got on an aeroplane and flew to Australia to go and spend time with him. He turned out to be fine, but the first couple of weeks I actually had to spend in a lockdown hotel in Perth. They know how to do lockdown properly in Australia, which is one of the reasons why their numbers of cases are so small. But while I was there, the virus really took off in Melbourne. And one of the stories was that one of the reasons that it happened was that the guards in the lockdown hotels in Victoria had been having sex with some of the people who were staying there that they were supposed to be guarding in the hotels. And so part of my story is that I was not offered anything like that. So that's my dramatic experience of flying halfway across the world. But the other part of the story is just simply constantly having to come to terms with the new world and the fact that this world is different from the old world. And I just heard you use the word emergence, Imogen, and that makes me think about the new stage that we are kind of in, but kind of being pushed back into the previous stage all at the same time. So where are we going? Are we coming out? Are we going back in? What's going on? So it's been a constant process of having to be gentle with myself and gentle with people around me and saying, we are just all struggling with this, and this is quite tough.
Thank you, Meg. And I wonder, are there particular bits of the Bible that you go to as you reflect on your story?
So, Imogen, I've done quite a bit of writing about telling my story along with Bible stories. So I started with Abraham, and Joseph has been the most recent one. So Joseph's story I've thought about a lot. But in general terms, the whole Old Testament story of the exile, I think, has a real model and a shape for us at the moment. God's people were defeated, their army was defeated, Jerusalem was destroyed, which is a little bit like actually New York being destroyed. No one expected that anybody could damage New York, and so it was a bit like that. And the people were sent off into exile in Babylon, and everything in their world had changed. And one of the things that we can see from the way that various bits of the Old Testament tell this story is that the people themselves had to tell the story over and over again to try and make sense of it, and maybe even more importantly, to try and work out who they were. And one of the things that they really realized was that they could only know who they were by knowing who they were in relationship with God. Their identity was as God's chosen people. And if God had allowed the Babylonians to defeat them and to drag them away from the land that God had promised them, which was kind of like the underpinning of the whole relationship between them, then what had happened? Had God given up on them, or had they backed the wrong horse, or what was it that had happened? And they needed to tell stories about that to try and find ways of making meaning so that they could still believe that God was God and that God loved them. And they managed to find ways to do that. But then once the exile was over and they were allowed to do the thing that they'd longed to do for so long, to return to Jerusalem, they had to start telling stories all over again because the exile stories didn't work for the return. So that reminds me of how we're in a kind of exile. It's a strange one because we haven't actually moved geographically. We're in the same places, we're in our own houses, but still we're exiled from our lives. And what is God telling us in the middle of all of this? And how do we understand who we are and who we are in relationship with God in the middle of it all? And most of us will have come to some kind of understanding during lockdown itself. But what do we do now if lockdown is partly over and partly isn't? What stories do we tell ourselves?
I love that thing about having to keep telling our stories. I think that's really fascinating. And the way that stories help guide us through trauma and tragedy. And I know that you've been involved in a project called Tragedy and Congregations. I wonder how that project helps you think about COVID-19.
A lot, actually. One of the things that's really helpful is learning something of the sense of how a trauma moves in time, what happens, the way in which people and emotions rise and fall over the period of the trauma. Right at the very beginning of a trauma, for example, there's what's called the heroic phase. And people do extraordinary things and communities do extraordinary things in the early days of a trauma. And that's rather like us all standing out on our front doorsteps, banging our saucepans and clapping for the NHS and all the things that we banded together and did. And then followed by the inevitable periods of disillusionment and the very slow process of recovery. But in thinking about stories, one of the things that's been most useful out of the project is that it started me thinking quite a lot about resilience as well. And those two things of trauma and resilience go really closely hand in hand. And resilience is highly bound up with storytelling. One of the main resilience skills is called reframing, and it's the ability to be flexible in retelling your story constantly so that it incorporates the new and traumatic circumstances into your old story, and so that you build a framework around the story which is big enough so that it's bigger than this current trauma, and it looks back to all the things from your past that give you hope, and it looks forward to things in the future that find places for that hope to manifest. So ideas about resilience and the need to constantly retell our story, partly for the purpose, just as the Israelites were doing, of recreating our identity, has been hugely valuable.
Meg, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Imogen and I are going to be trying to carry on having conversations like this, keeping telling stories and keeping helping people to frame their stories as you suggest. And if people want, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to go with a shameful plug that
Yes.
If you're interested in this idea of reframing your story, I talk about it a lot in my recent book, Joseph, A Story of Resilience. And I wrote it before COVID, but It's just too relevant.
Yeah, no, it's not a shameful plug. It is a rightly shameless one. And our more trivial plug is that if you want to find this whole project, you can find it at meaningmaking.carrd.co. And card is spelled CARRD. meaningmaking.carrd.co.
Thank you, Meg. That was fascinating. I wish we had much longer to hear from you. But our next conversation is with Reverend Canon Timothy Good, who's the vicar of St Margaret's Church in Lee and a member of the National Disability Group, which advises the archbishops in the Church of England. Thank you for listening.